Her death was ruled a suicide, but the phone records tell a different story. August 4, 1962, the night Marilyn Monroe died, 8 hours vanished from official records. No autopsy photographs, no time of death, just a body and a story that changed 3 times before sunrise. The world mourned an icon. Hollywood buried its secrets. And for 60 years, the truth stayed locked behind studio gates, government files, and the silence of men who had everything to lose. Until now. The icon everyone thought they knew. She was the most photographed woman in the world. Flash bulbs captured every smile, every curve, every manufactured moment of Hollywood perfection. But behind the platinum hair and breathy voice lived Norma Jean, the foster child who never stopped searching for love in all the wrong places. By 1962, Marilyn Monroe had everything America told her to want: fame, beauty, wealth. She'd seduced audiences in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and Some Like It Hot. She'd married a baseball god and a literary genius. Magazine covers, movie premieres, the American dream incarnate. But in the Spanish colonial mansion at 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive, Brentwood, Marilyn was drowning. Prescription bottles lined her nightstand like sentries. Nembutal, chloral hydrate, pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to numb the gnawing emptiness that fame couldn't fill. Her last film, Something's Got to Give, had been a disaster. Fired by Fox Studios for chronic absences. Rumors of instability, of mental breakdown, of dangerous liaisons that could topple presidencies. The same industry that built her was now dismantling her, brick by brick. In the sweltering Los Angeles heat of that August weekend, Marilyn made phone calls. Desperate calls. Calls to friends, to lovers, to anyone who might anchor her to a world that felt increasingly unreal. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, would later tell police that Marilyn seemed fine that evening. The phone records suggest otherwise. The calls that were erased. Between 7:30 p.m. and 3:30 a.m. on August 4th and 5th, Marilyn Monroe's phone line showed activity. Multiple calls, long conversations, connections to numbers that, when traced years later by investigators, led to places the official story never mentioned. But here's where it gets strange. The original phone records from that night disappeared from LAPD files within 48 hours of her death. Gone, as if they'd never existed. It took private investigator Milo Speriglio 20 years to track down copies, preserved by a phone company clerk who sensed something was wrong. When those records surfaced in the 1980s, they revealed calls to Washington, D.C., to Justice Department extensions, to private lines in Georgetown townhouses. One number appeared 3 times that final evening, a direct line to the Department of Justice. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's office. The same Robert Kennedy who, according to multiple witnesses, had been at Marilyn's home that very afternoon, though he would later claim he was in Northern California, 100 miles away. The same Robert Kennedy whose affair with Marilyn had become Hollywood's worst-kept secret. The same Robert Kennedy who had everything to lose if their relationship went public. Peter Lawford, the actor who married into the Kennedy family and served as a bridge between Hollywood and Camelot, received calls from Marilyn that night too. Years later, in interviews conducted before his death, Lawford's statements would shift, contradict, evolve, as if he were constantly editing a script he could never quite get right. She was saying goodbye, Lawford told investigators in 1975, his voice heavy with what might have been guilt or whiskey or both. She sounded strange. I wanted to go over there, but I was told not to. Told by whom, he never said, or perhaps he couldn't. The house of Esicirities. 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive. A modest home by Hollywood standards, Spanish tiles, a small pool, a guest cottage where Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, supposedly slept. Marilyn had purchased it in February 1962, her first real home after years of hotels and borrowed spaces. She'd paid cash, $77,500. She'd planted flowers, hung Mexican furniture, finally created a sanctuary. It would become her tomb. The official timeline states that Eunice Murray noticed a light under Marilyn's bedroom door around 3:30 a.m. The door was locked. Murray called Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, who arrived and broke a window to enter. Marilyn was found dead, naked, face down on the bed, phone receiver in her hand, empty pill bottles on the nightstand. But witness statements don't align. Neighbors reported seeing an ambulance arrive much earlier, around midnight, then leave, then return hours later. Ambulance driver James Hall later claimed he responded to the house while Marilyn was still alive, barely conscious, and was ordered to leave by men he didn't recognize. Men in suits, men who didn't want documentation. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the coroner who performed the autopsy, found enough barbiturates in Marilyn's system to kill 3 people. Yet there were no pills in her stomach, no residue in her digestive tract. The drugs had been absorbed directly into her bloodstream, consistent with injection, not oral ingestion. There were no needle marks on her body, except for a small, unexplained bruise on her hip. In all my years as a medical examiner, Dr. Noguchi would later write, Marilyn Monroe's autopsy remains one of the most puzzling I've ever conducted. The evidence simply doesn't match the conclusion. The conclusion, officially, was probable suicide. The evidence suggested something far more sinister. The Kennedy connection. John and Robert Kennedy, the brothers who ran the free world and, according to multiple sources, shared the same mistress. Marilyn had been introduced to the Kennedys through Peter Lawford, the charming British actor whose marriage to JFK's sister Pat gave him access to America's most powerful family. By 1962, Marilyn's affairs with both brothers were spiraling out of control. She'd become obsessed, possessive, dangerously unstable. She threatened to hold a press conference, to tell the world about her relationships, to expose the men who'd used her and then discarded her like yesterday's starlet. For the Kennedys, Marilyn Monroe had transformed from fantasy to liability. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover knew. His files on Marilyn Monroe, eventually declassified decades later, document surveillance, wiretaps, detailed reports of her movements. Hoover collected secrets like trophies, and the Kennedy-Monroe connection was pure gold, insurance against the brothers who otherwise might have fired him. CIA counterintelligence had concerns too. Marilyn had been linked to individuals of dubious loyalty, code for suspected communist sympathizers, her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller, who'd been investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee, had raised red flags. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, was a Freudian Marxist whose patient list included suspected Soviet agents. In the paranoid logic of Cold War intelligence agencies, Marilyn Monroe represented a potential security breach. A woman who knew presidential secrets, who might talk, who might be compromised. On May 19, 1962, Marilyn had sung "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" at Madison Square Garden, wearing a dress so tight it had to be sewn onto her body. 12,000 people watched her breathy, seductive performance. Millions more saw the footage on television. Jackie Kennedy, watching from the White House, allegedly turned to an aide and said, "I feel sorry for her. He never was and never will be the man she needs." Less than 3 months later, Marilyn was dead. But what happened that last day? August 4th, 1962 started like any other Saturday in Brentwood. Hot, bright, the kind of California sunshine that makes the rest of America dream of moving west. Marilyn spent the morning on the phone, a call to her ex-husband Joe DiMaggio Jr., another to her masseur, routine conversations with friends. Around 4:00 p.m., according to multiple witnesses, Robert Kennedy arrived at Marilyn's home. He was accompanied by his brother-in-law Peter Lawford. What happened during that visit remains one of the great mysteries of the case. Marilyn's neighbor, Abe Landau, later told investigators he saw a dark sedan with government plates parked outside her house that afternoon. Elizabeth Pollard, another neighbor, reported hearing shouting, a woman's voice, high and distressed, and a man's voice, angry, forceful. By 7:00 p.m., Kennedy and Lawford were gone. Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, claims Marilyn seemed agitated but not suicidal. Dr. Greenson made a house call around 7:30 p.m., unusual for a Saturday evening, and stayed approximately an hour. Then came the missing hours. Between 8:30 p.m. and 3:30 a.m., what happened inside that Spanish colonial house? Who came and went? What calls were made? What was said in those final, desperate conversations? The official story claims Marilyn took pills, locked her door, and died alone. But the evidence, what little survived, suggests a much more complex scenario. The phone records showing multiple calls, the ambulance arrival and departure, the time lag before police were finally summoned. Peter Lawford, in a taped interview conducted shortly before his death, described receiving a phone call from Marilyn around 7:45 p.m. Her speech was slurred. She said something about saying goodbye to everyone. Then the line went dead. Lawford called her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, who rushed to the house. Lawford claimed he wanted to go too, but was told explicitly not to involve himself. By whom? Lawford wouldn't say, but investigators believe it was either Robert Kennedy or Kennedy's security team, men who understood that any Kennedy proximity to a dead actress would be catastrophic. At 3:30 a.m., finally, the LAPD received a call. By then, whatever had happened in that house had been sanitized, cleaned, prepared for public consumption. The police who arrived found a scene that felt staged. Marilyn's body positioned almost too perfectly, pill bottles arranged just so, no glass of water nearby, yet she'd supposedly swallowed enough pills to kill 3 people. The first officer on scene, Jack Clemens, would later become one of the case's most vocal skeptics. It looked like the whole thing had been rehearsed, he told reporters in 1985. Everything was too neat, too controlled. I've seen genuine suicides and this wasn't one. The cover-up machine. Within hours of Marilyn's death, the machinery of concealment began its work. Studio executives called in favors. Lawyers rewrote timelines. Witnesses were encouraged to reconsider their memories. The original autopsy report, handwritten by Dr. Noguchi, disappeared from the coroner's files. Photographs of Marilyn's body, standard protocol in any sudden death investigation, were never taken. Or if they were, they vanished along with the phone records, the original police reports, the crime scene log. In 1982, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office conducted a threshold review of the case. Their conclusion, while the evidence raised substantial doubts about the suicide ruling, too much time had passed, too many witnesses had died, too much evidence had been destroyed to pursue a criminal investigation. The DA's report did note one chilling detail. Marilyn's home had been swept for listening devices just hours after her death. Multiple bugs were found in her phones, in her lamps, in her bedroom. Who placed them? FBI, CIA, private investigators working for the Kennedy family. The report doesn't say. But someone had been listening to every word she said. J. Edgar Hoover's secret files on Marilyn, partially declassified in the 2000s, reveal the extent of surveillance. Transcripts of phone calls, reports of visitors, detailed logs of her movements. The FBI had been watching Marilyn Monroe for years, tracking her associations, monitoring her relationships. Why? Officially, because of suspected communist ties. Unofficially, because she was sleeping with the President of the United States. The CIA files remain heavily redacted. Entire pages blacked out, names removed. But what survives suggests Marilyn had become a person of interest in counterintelligence operations, a liability to be managed, a risk to be contained. By any means necessary. The witnesses who changed their stories. In the weeks and months following Marilyn's death, key witnesses began walking back their statements. Details that had seemed certain became fuzzy, timelines shifted, memories transformed. Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, gave at least 3 different versions of that night's events. First, she said she noticed nothing unusual. Then she admitted seeing Marilyn agitated. Finally, decades later in a BBC documentary, she made a startling confession. Why, at my age, should I have to cover this up any longer? Marilyn died because of her association with Robert Kennedy. Dr. Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist, refused to discuss the case publicly. His private notes, sealed until 2039, may hold answers, or they may have been sanitized like everything else. Peter Lawford told different stories to different investigators. Sometimes Robert Kennedy was at the house that day. Sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes Marilyn's final phone call was a goodbye. Sometimes it was just another rambling conversation. The inconsistencies suggest either unreliable witnesses, or more likely, witnesses who'd been coached, pressured, or threatened into shaping their memories to fit an acceptable narrative. Sergeant Jack Clemens, the first police officer to arrive at Marilyn's home, became increasingly vocal about the inconsistencies he'd observed. He documented how the scene had been staged, how Marilyn's body had clearly been moved, how the bedroom door had been locked from the outside, not inside. Clemens was encouraged to retire early from the LAPD. His detailed reports about that night mysteriously vanished from department files. Before his death in 1998, he recorded extensive interviews about the case, maintaining until his final breath that Marilyn Monroe had been murdered. "I knew it that night," he said. "We all knew it, but nobody wanted to be the guy who took down a Kennedy." The alternative THEORIS. For 60 years, investigators, journalists, and conspiracy theorists have proposed alternative explanations for what happened on August 4, 1962. Some plausible, some fantastical, all attempting to reconcile the evidence with the official story's glaring holes. Theory 1. Accidental overdose with cover-up. Perhaps Marilyn did take pills, not to die, but to sleep, mixing medications without realizing the lethal combination. When someone found her dying, panic ensued. Rather than call an ambulance immediately and risk scandal, key figures attempted to save her privately. When she died anyway, they staged the scene to look like a straightforward suicide, minimizing Kennedy involvement. This theory explains the time delays, the sanitized crime scene, the missing records. It doesn't require murder, just cowardice and self-preservation. Theory 2. Intentional silencing. The darker scenario. Marilyn had become too dangerous. Her threats to go public, her emotional instability, her knowledge of state secrets, all combined to make her an unacceptable risk. Someone, CIA, FBI, Kennedy security, Mafia contractors, administered a fatal dose of barbiturates, then arranged the scene to look like suicide. This theory is supported by the lack of pills in her stomach, the unexplained bruise, the sophisticated surveillance equipment found in her home, and the immediate, coordinated cover-up that followed. Theory 3. The accidental enema. Dr. Noguch's autopsy revealed the drugs were absorbed directly into her bloodstream without passing through her digestive system. Some investigators believe Marilyn may have been administered a barbiturate enema, a medical practice of the time, either by her psychiatrist or housekeeper, as a sleep aid. An accidental overdose through this method would explain the toxicology without requiring murder. The bruise on her hip, consistent with an injection site, the lack of stomach contents, explained by the alternative delivery method. This theory suggests tragic accident rather than conspiracy, but still requires explaining the cover-up, the missing records, the false timelines. Theory 4. The intelligence operation. The most elaborate theory involves multiple agencies. Marilyn had been compromised by Soviet intelligence, or was about to be. Her relationships with the Kennedy brothers, her access to classified information, pillow talk is still talk, her erratic behavior, all made her a walking security breach. CIA counterintelligence couldn't arrest a movie star without creating an international incident, so they neutralized the threat permanently, staging a suicide that would attract gossip but not investigation. The FBI, already surveilling her, looked the other way. The Kennedy family, desperate to avoid scandal, facilitated the cover-up. This theory requires the most coordination, but also explains why so much evidence disappeared so quickly, and why no serious criminal investigation ever occurred. Hash the documents that emerged. In the decades following Marilyn's death, documents have trickled out from various sources, leaked, declassified, discovered in estate sales and dusty archives. Each new revelation adds another piece to the puzzle. In 1982, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's review uncovered witness statements that had never been included in the original investigation. Neighbors who heard arguments, ambulance drivers who'd been at the scene twice, security personnel who'd been paid to forget what they saw. The FBI files, partially released in 2012 under Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed the extent of government surveillance. Marilyn Monroe had been watched, tracked, and documented with the kind of attention usually reserved for espionage suspects or organized crime figures. Why? The files cite national security concerns related to her associations. But reading between the heavily redacted lines, it's clear the FBI was building a case against the Kennedy brothers, collecting evidence of their affair with Marilyn as potential leverage. J. Edgar Hoover never got to use it. Marilyn died, and the evidence died with her, or was made to disappear. Private investigators working on behalf of the Monroe estate and various journalists have uncovered additional material. Marilyn's diary, which disappeared after her death, but was apparently read by multiple witnesses who described entries about the president and Bobby. Personal letters to and from the Kennedy brothers, which have never surfaced publicly but are referenced in multiple accounts. And recorded phone conversations, allegedly made by either Marilyn herself or by the surveillance teams watching her, which reportedly still exist in private collections. In 2022, the CIA released additional documents related to Hollywood personalities of counterintelligence interest during the Cold War period. Marilyn Monroe's name appears multiple times, with entire sections still classified. The reasons given for continued secrecy, protecting ongoing intelligence operations and sources. 60 years later, and someone still doesn't want the full story told. Hash the unanswered questions. Why were Marilyn's phone records taken from LAPD files within 48 hours of her death? Who ordered the removal of her diary from the house before police completed their investigation? What happened during the 8 missing hours between Robert Kennedy's visit and the 3:30 a.m. call to police? Why was no autopsy toxicology performed on her liver or other organs, standard procedure that might have revealed the drug delivery method? Who installed the surveillance equipment in her home, and what happened to the recordings? Why did the coroner's office lose the original autopsy photographs and handwritten notes? What was in the sealed envelope that Marilyn reportedly gave to her publicist days before her death, with instructions to open this if anything happens to me? The envelope has never been found. Why did Robert Kennedy's phone records from August 4-5, 1962, also disappear from Justice Department files? What did Peter Lawford know that he couldn't say, even decades later when most of the principals were dead? And perhaps most troubling, why has no serious criminal investigation ever been conducted? Despite mounting evidence that something far more complex than suicide occurred that August night. The legacy of silence. 60 years have passed since Marilyn Monroe died in that small bedroom in Brentwood. 60 years of speculation, investigation, revelation, and continued mystery. The principals are all dead now. John Kennedy assassinated 15 months after Marilyn. Robert Kennedy murdered in 1968. Peter Lawford dead in 1984. J. Edgar Hoover gone in 1972. The truth, if it still exists anywhere, remains locked in classified files, sealed archives, and the fading memories of witnesses who chose silence over revelation. Marilyn's grave at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery attracts visitors constantly. They leave flowers, lipstick kisses on the marble, notes telling her she's still loved. Joe DiMaggio, who never stopped loving her, had red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week for 20 years after her death. He never remarried. To his dying day, he believed she'd been murdered. The official cause of death remains probable suicide from acute barbiturate poisoning. But the word probable carries weight. It's not definite, not conclusive. It's the legal system's way of saying, this is the story we're going with, even though we know it doesn't quite fit. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, who performed the autopsy, wrote in his memoir, "I shall always wonder what Marilyn Monroe would have told me if she could have spoken to me for 1 hour about the circumstances leading to her death. That hour never came. The truth died with her, or was buried by men who had too much to lose if it ever emerged." What we know now. The evidence, accumulated over 6 decades of investigation, suggests several near certainties. Marilyn Monroe did not die alone in a locked bedroom from a simple overdose of sleeping pills. The physical evidence contradicts that scenario at multiple points. Robert Kennedy was in Los Angeles on August 4, 1962, despite initial denials. Multiple witnesses place him at Marilyn's home that afternoon. The attempts to claim he was in Northern California have been thoroughly debunked. A coordinated effort occurred immediately following Marilyn's death to remove evidence, alter timelines, and manage the narrative. This wasn't random confusion. It was systematic concealment involving law enforcement, government agencies, and private fixers. Marilyn's home was under active surveillance at the time of her death. Someone was listening. Someone was watching. Someone knew what happened. The Kennedy brothers had powerful motivation to ensure Marilyn could not go public with their affairs. Their political careers, their reputations, their place in history, all hung in the balance. Whether her death was murder, manslaughter, accidental overdose, or assisted suicide remains unclear. But it was not the simple story presented to the public in August 1962. The phone that never stopped ringing. In the final analysis, perhaps the most haunting detail is that telephone receiver found in Marilyn's hand when her body was discovered. Who was she calling, or who had just called her? The phone records that would answer that question vanished before they could be properly analyzed. All we have are fragments, copies of copies, and the testimony of investigators who saw the originals and remembered numbers that traced back to Washington, to Georgetown, to the centers of power. Marilyn Monroe spent her final hours on the phone, reaching out, trying to connect, searching for someone who could save her from whatever darkness was closing in. Those calls went unanswered, or perhaps worse, they were answered by people who decided she'd become too dangerous to save. The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe isn't just that she died at 36, at the height of her beauty and fame. It's that she died reaching for help that never came, surrounded by people who cared more about protecting themselves than protecting her. The phone calls she made that night, to friends, to lovers, to the men who used her and discarded her, were her final desperate attempt to matter, to be heard, to be saved. Instead, she became Hollywood's most famous unsolved mystery, a cautionary tale about the price of beauty, the cost of fame, and what happens when you become inconvenient to powerful men. Somewhere in a sealed government file or a private collection, the full truth might still exist. The complete phone records, the missing diary, the photographs that were never supposed to be taken, the recordings someone made of her final hours. Until those emerge, if they ever do, we're left with fragments, contradictions, and questions that will never be fully answered. Marilyn Monroe wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted to be more than just a pretty face, more than a sex symbol, more than the blonde with the breathy voice. She studied at the Actors Studio. She read Dostoevsky. She married brilliant men. She fought for creative control. But in the end, she was treated like every woman who becomes inconvenient, silenced, sanitized, and turned into a palatable myth. Her death certificate says suicide. The evidence says cover-up. The truth says something in between, something messy and tragic and deeply American. A story about power, sex, secrets, and the machinery that protects the powerful at any cost. 60 years later, that phone is still ringing in our collective memory, and nobody is answering. Because the truth about what happened to Marilyn Monroe on August 4th, 1962, died with her in that small bedroom in Brentwood. Or it's locked in a vault somewhere, waiting for someone brave enough to finally open the door.